it's going to be probably the same level of nerdiness than we had just before. So I mean, page speed kind of is an interesting one, right? So I thought what I'd do, and then maybe to pick up on the question that we had, I'm going to put the slides, or there's a link to the slides, so you don't have to kind of write everything down. It's all in there. So it's like kind of I try to do I'd say a checklisted approach and walk you through the stuff that I'm seeing. Either going wrong or just people don't kind of realize. And then also I brought some new stuff that Google recently did with Chrome and some things around they changed. So I thought that might be interesting to kind of follow up as well. So and I think just to kind of set a baseline, and I'm not going to bother long with numbers. I guess we kind of all figured by now that as Björn just said, that speed kind of is important depending on which side you're on, be it techie, so ranking factor, or be that user experience. I kind of tend to think more the latter, but one way or the other. And then also what the Searchmetrics study recently again showed is that we obviously see kind of an increase in sites, or basically how fast they respond. If you look at the top 10 this year versus last year, it's just people seem to really care about speed. And I think there's a good reason for that. I'm not sure if you have seen any of those, but actually Google is really heavily kind of pushing us towards taking it seriously. I mean, I would not, and there's those funny, I know the screen's a bit blurry, but I would not want to be the one having the slow to load attached to his snippet. I mean, that's an obvious kind of CTR killer, right? I don't want to be the idiot, like people saying, okay, don't click on this result, it's slow. I think that's not a good idea. And then also a bit of an issue with the number they have in the Search Console, right? So there's this time spent downloading, right? There's this number and the graph. And the problem is this number is really, really shit, to be very honest. And it's shit because of the fact that they're looking at different file types at once. So that's HTML, that's CSS, that's JavaScript. So it doesn't anyhow tell you actually how fast a site really feels, right? So this is just, it's kind of useless if you ask me. I mean, this is like maybe a trend line that you could have a look at, but it doesn't really tell you much. So I'm going to be picking up on proper measurement a bit later as well. Recent numbers, and this is from Nielsen, I think we have, and just remember this 2 seconds because I'm coming back to that in a bit, but we literally have 2 seconds and then people start leaving in heavy numbers. So it's like, it's this 2 second span that we have. I like this one better. So the level of stress caused by delays on mobile is comparable to watching a horror movie. I think that's the thing I can remember that works better. But really it is about user experience. People are annoyed and people leave if you don't deliver fast. And I think that's the core message. And also if you're working in corporates, right, the issue we usually see is that people are like struggling to get kind of budget approvals for performance-related tasks. So really try to team up with the UX team because there's also usually budget, and you can kind of try to make joint projects out of it. That often helps. So, I collected 10 things, and I want to kind of briefly walk you through some of them. Some are probably no-brainers, others are not. So just a very quick rundown on the most important stuff. Especially if you work internationally, this would be probably the first thing I'd be looking at is the time to first byte. So basically, it kind of tells you how fast a server or any given system generally responds. So this is like a pretty, it's kind of the first number basically that you could look at. Again, it doesn't really reflect the full picture of how a site, and then Bartosz mentioned that briefly already. I think there's better measurement points that we should look at. But this is especially important. And if you want to give it an easy try, if you work on like multiple locations, there's a nice free tool on KeyCDN where you can just plug in any domain that runs different tests from different locations and gives you the kind of the TTFB from the different locations. And then the obvious question that follows usually is, how fast is fast enough? I mean, there's never a fast enough probably, but then the question is, what's the number I should kind of aim towards to, and that's somewhere around the 200 milliseconds. So either that's depending on the geo. So if you're serving Asia and you do that with a server from within Europe, that doesn't work. You can't manage that. So or the other way around. The other thing. And that's just a brief check as well. The single biggest issue, and then Bartosz briefly touched on the differences between HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2. I think that's a big thing to understand. But generally, still the biggest issue in performance is really the amount of requests. So if you think about how a browser does that, right? What happens is they request images, they request CSS, they request all the other assets. And what happens is with the assets is browsers have a natural limit on how many requests they can do at once, or they're actually allowed to do at once. It's a security reason, and it's different per browser. So their usual is somewhere between 6 and 8. And then the first component, say, like if you request 10 images, they deliver 5, and then the 6th only start if the first comes back. So that's the way it works. And then you get this kind of waterfall on how things are processed. But basically, the biggest issue is the sheer amount of requests that we have nowadays, because the web is growing, and the sites are getting more complex, and therefore the requests are just growing and growing and growing. So what really shocked me when I looked into numbers again is the fact that if you look at the amount of CSS, this is just ridiculous, right? If we have like 6.4 CSS files per any given request, like any given page, this is a lot. Like in the best case, I would want 1, right? Or probably even none. So we can talk about that in a second. So this is like growing and growing. So this is a real-world thing, and you recall maybe the 2 seconds I just mentioned earlier. If you're Deichmann, and if you're wasting 23 requests and 3 seconds where nothing happens, you lost 40% of your people, right? This is ridiculous, and this is real world. So this is just from last week. And then they're doing loads of JavaScript, loads of CSS, and all the other stuff, and nothing happens. And at some point, somewhere here, they're starting to load the first image that you actually can see in the screen. So this is really bad. So if that's happening, that's probably the first and obvious thing, consolidation, minifying, and just getting kind of rid of the overhead in terms of requests. I'm not going to walk you through that, but I guess that's fairly obvious. The other big one in every sense of the word is images. If you have ever taken an image out of Photoshop and saved that and put it straight into the web, I guess you know what I'm talking about. So like there's this crazy overhead, they are super big, there's metadata, they're not compressed. They might look very nice, but you wouldn't see any difference if you do proper optimization on images. So my favorite, but again, there's loads of different ones, is a tool called TinyPNG or TinyJPEG, one or the other. I like it because what they have is they have a straight integration into Photoshop. So you could kind of talk to the teams that do the creative part and basically make them use the plugin and save it optimized straight away. Either you do that way or you build something into the CMS or the WordPress or the whatever system you're using, that whenever something is being uploaded, it will be run through a service like this one or any other ones that do image optimization by default. Because the issue is, if you don't have it in a system, then people will just forget about it, and it's just not going to happen. So it's like you'd be amazed if you do an audit today and audit 6 months later, and then just look at the new images, how often people just forget to optimize images. So I would kind of try to have like a way that people cannot not do it. And lastly, I guess, and I'm sure at least the top left, you have, like everyone has seen that at some point. It's just the way Google integrated, or is still integrating on some sites, the tracking snippet for analytics. So the way it works in this case is it's asynchronous, and that just means they fire away the request, but they don't wait for the response, right? And that makes just the browser to continue the render without waiting for the request to come back. And you could use that, like in HTML5, they introduced this new element called async, or the new attribute called async. This is quite nice. However, the issue is they don't care about execution. So if you have still multiple JavaScripts, that might cause problems. Then it might be something like a loader. But the general idea of all of this is take off as much weight from the request, so images, JavaScript, CSS, as possible, because then the browser can just render faster. Another one, and I'd say that's getting worse, like at least in the last 2 years, if you look at the numbers. We have this issue with custom fonts. I mean, they're pretty beautiful, I get that, but performance-wise, it's a pain, especially on mobile. Because, like in this again, latest numbers, almost 120 kilobytes added just for having fonts, and you need that to be loaded before anything else can happen, right? Because if you don't have the font installed on the system, nothing can be displayed. So this is also a big one, and then again, and this is how it looks like usually, right? You just go, you do a link rel style sheet, and you load the font from any source that is, either internally or externally. And then if you look at the page speed insights, obviously Google is already kind of starting to complain that this is probably not the best idea because getting external fonts is apparently slow. So again, same solution as they did with with analytics. So they created this thing called Webfonts.js, which is a kind of a font loading device. So if you would be using any font that's not on the system, or that's just kind of a custom font, or that you have even someone had built that for you, then you would be using something like this. I thought, at least. The issue is, if you look a bit deeper, it's shit, again. So, because what happens is, if you have seen that at some point, what happens is if you load a font asynchronously, they take a system default, and then they load the other one, and it just kind of flickers. So this is just like a very tiny blink, and this is like really shit in terms of user experience, because then sometimes things are moving around, and then you click on a link, and you just don't find the link because it's just moving because of different fonts. So not a good idea. There is, the link is in there, so you can just follow up on that. If you're using any type of custom font that's not on a system, so no, I don't know, Tahoma, Arial, whatever that is, this is what I would do. Just walk through it with the tech guys. There is a way to do it, and there's a way to do it fast, and there's a way that also doesn't make the site flicker around. There's something new as well. I haven't had the chance to play with it. It just recently came with the, because Google is apparently aware of that issue, and because this is all workarounds and hacks to A, be able to use the custom fonts, but B, to make it fast. So this is what they introduced now, kind of font display strategies to kind of figure out, what's the default behavior. So should I wait? Should I kind of let it flicker, or is there any backfill logic that I want for my site? So this is probably worth investigating. The other one, and this is also quite interesting, is you could bring in a bit kind of intelligence from different sources, and I'll talk about that in a second, from different sources to really figure out which components of a site you would be needing at what stage. So prefetching and pre-rendering. The idea, and this is, quickly walk you through it. So the idea is, if you look at NetDoctor, right? So this is a health site, and what they do is they have their CSS and also their images. They are on a different domain, so on a CDN. So it's not on www.netdoctor.de, but in this case, the CSS comes from static.netdoctor.de. So that's quite common, and lots of people do that. It can be Cloudflare, can be any other CDN in the world. The problem is, technically, the first request, so the request to static.netdoctor.de will be kind of translated to an IP address, right? So that happens for every domain or subdomain. And this takes a bit of time. So in this case, it takes like 333 milliseconds. And obviously, the CSS is important, so you have to wait for it in this case, and you're kind of losing 300 milliseconds. So what you could do, or what you should do, not only could do, why is that not working? Okay, is that you could do DNS prefetching. So for every domain or external kind of host name that you're getting data from, what you could do is you could tell the browser just straight away to kind of resolve this domain to IP address thing in the background, and then when the first request hits, it just doesn't wait for it. So that's pretty easy. It's 2 lines of code. Well, 1 line of code in this case. It's just 2 lines because they're doing that for 2 different host names. So if you go to webpagetest.org and put in any given domain, they give you the most commonly used host names for your domain, and then you could just prefetch those. And you can even, if you're on HTTPS, which you should be, then you can combine the prefetch with preconnect, and then the difference there is, what we have in HTTPS is this thing called handshake, so basically the validation of the certificate, and you could also do that in the background. So you combine prefetch and preconnect for any of the given, and that's why I meant 2 lines of code, for any of the given domains. And you could also bring in even more logic, so that's in the background, but if you think about it, say like you're on an article, right, that has like 3 pages. The chance that people go from one page and continue reading on the other one are pretty high. So what you could do on page 1 is you could actually preload page 2, and then when you click, or that person clicks, it's just an instant, right? It's like it's straight there because it's already in the cache of the browser. And if you want to do that with a bit more logic even, you could go, and that's what I like doing, is you go into analytics and you look at the most common kind of user journeys, you combine it with the analytics API, and then you figure out, and obviously things like if you're in a shopping kind of context and you have the basket, and then people go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, it's like it's common sense to just load the next step in the journey. And that's not SEO, that's really user experience in this case, right? But this is really cool because it's just like you click on it, it's instantly there, you don't have to wait for anything. Yeah, so this is like AMP is an interesting one. So who's using AMPs anyways? Just, ooh, Jesus. I have my, well, I'm not the biggest fan of AMP, to be very honest, but that's mainly because I just don't like, and then Bartosz touched on that. I didn't like the way they kind of introduced that and how they kind of politically, I wouldn't say misuse it, but it's like, it's really annoying, right? If you're a publisher and you want to be in this carousel, there's just no solution other than using this shitty thing. So I'm like, yeah. I think you got my pain. It's like, it's really castrated HTML, right? And they kind of try to reinvent kind of a markup and make it fast. But I guess you could also build, and I know that you could also build fast sites without doing that. I do understand where they're coming from, though. Obviously, with all the limitations, you're kind of forced to write proper code. So I got that. But still, it's kind of a bit of an annoyance. Nevertheless, on the speed side of things, surprisingly, well, not really surprisingly, because you can't do much, but on the speed side of things, it's just insanely fast, right? It's insanely fast compared to any other mobile experience, and that's obviously just because of the fact that it's so heavily prefetched, cached, and pre-rendered that it just can't be slow. It's just impossible. If you build the AMP the way it's supposed to be built, it is pretty fast. The other number that really scared me, and I think is really bad, and I'm curious what's going to happen now. Lots of people were actually using this like AMP as kind of an acquisition page, right? So you had some parts of the content in the AMP, and then you try to transition them to the proper user experience, which makes sense in a way. So this is going to be fucked next year anyways. They announced that they're going to be doing this match with the canonical and the rel AMP, so that needs to be the same. So it's going to be interesting. Nevertheless, even that, the transition is just 3%. So like, it doesn't work. You get them there, they read and they go. They're not going on your brand. They're not interacting with your site. So I just generally at least advise to think about the fact if that's really the kind of castrated, stripped down user experience that you want to deliver with AMP. So, but there's no answer. I can't answer that for you. Just have to figure it out for yourself, I guess. It gains, still it's growing. It's getting crazy popular. We have, especially with Baidu now joining. I mean, it's not AMP on Baidu, but it's literally the same syntax. It just has a different name and another CDN. We have, in Carousel, we have for recipes, and Markus touched on that quickly in the keynote. We even have also the need, if you want to have the recipe thing in the slider, there's no way to do it without either A, structured data, and B, without being on AMP. So it's really, they're really pushing that. Surprisingly, well, not surprisingly actually, if you look at it from the publisher side, monetization is still a problem. So again, take that into consideration if you want to do it. And we're going to be seeing loads of more stuff, right? So in the States, especially eBay, they already have it. So AMP for e-commerce is actually there. So if you're doing shop, if you are a shop, if you're running a shop, WooCommerce, like the biggest shop system for WordPress, rolled it out as well. So really, there will be more AMP. So at least have a look, even though I'm, to be honest, not the biggest fan, but it kind of serves the purpose on having a fast site. However, I would always do baseline work first, get your site fast, and then do AMP on top. Funny thing though is, for those of you who have been around for a while, you might have seen this at some point. So Google had this, I think, 4 or 5 years back, saying like, okay, you just have a desktop site, but you're surfing on a mobile device, and they just give you this layer that says like, make the page mobile friendly, and then they create the right one just for you by magic. You don't have to do anything. The new thing is they're now using the AMP stack and the AMP framework to do that. I don't want to judge it legally. I'm not sure if that's actually even okay in Germany, but it's interesting because there's no opt-out. So if you're on an old site that's desktop only, they will just do it for you. HTTPS and HTTP2 are also, I think, kind of obvious. Hopefully, who's not on HTTPS yet? Ha! Seriously? That's good. I think that's the first time ever that no one is raising hands. Do you know then also if you're running on HTTP2? Who knows for sure that you're running on HTTP2? Okay, the rest, then the biggest homework when you go back home is check if you do that. So the thing is, and I do that quickly, then I can catch up on time. So we obviously have this increase on HTTPS results, which I think makes total sense. I don't believe in this boost or no boost discussion. I think that's entirely useless anyways. What I do believe, though, is this is interesting because they're now forcing you in the future to use, to have HTTPS to use AMP. So that's interesting because that wasn't the same when they initially launched it. What I really think is way more interesting is what they're doing in Chrome, but I think you're already sold on that anyways. Like, since you're on HTTPS, I don't have to dig into that, but this Chrome will be even pushing further with that. I'm assuming, if you have seen the test with the with this slow-to-load thing, I guess this is not far off to kind of suspect that something like non-secure is also going to be appear in the SERPs next year. So that's an interesting one. A couple of test tools in there to just, if you go home that I said, like, run the HTTP2 test. The issue is HTTPS is great, but HTTPS by design is slower than HTTP. And that's just because of this certificate that I just mentioned. So you have to do this certificate handshake and validation. So the first request is always a bit slower. So even if you would gain that boost, if it's there or not, I don't know. But even if you would gain that boost and you don't do HTTP2, you'd be slower. So really have a check if that's done, because then even by design you just have a faster kind of background stack that does HTTPS plus HTTP2, and you don't lose on the performance side. Sticking with tools for a bit more, I'm sure everyone knows that one. Don't use it. It's just, it doesn't help. Seriously, it's a stupid number. They're going to take a number away. I'm so happy. I was so happy when I heard that last or 2 weeks ago that they're going to strip out this page speed score. It's just great. Because, seriously, if you do a 98 out of 100 or a 78 out of 100, oftentimes it doesn't tell you anything. And it doesn't, oftentimes also the recommendation you get out of that one is just not doable, right? So I can't make the Facebook pixel any faster. It's like, if Facebook doesn't do that, I can't do anything about that. So 2 things that I would do. That one I mentioned earlier, web page test. They have, so you can plug in any URL and basically run loads of different reports. And what they also have is something called the film strip view on the right-hand side. So basically, they even do a video on how the site renders, and they break it down into very different things. There's also this time to first byte that I mentioned initially. So this has everything, literally. The new kit, so to say, is Google Lighthouse. This is really cool. This came into, I think, one of the last versions in Chrome. And I suppose, and I was chatting with Jono about that earlier, I guess that they will be using Lighthouse because web page test is also backed by Google. I suppose that they will be kind of taking Lighthouse into a hosted version in the future, and then we kind of getting rid of web page tests because they just have way more modern stuff in here. You could also do, so they have parts of usability in there, but they also have measurement and performance analytics for PWAs in there and all the other stuff which web page test can't do. So I think this is really an interesting one. And you can run it, if you're on a Chrome, you can just open the dev console and there's a Lighthouse button. It's a bit hidden, I don't know why, but there's a button called Lighthouse, and you can run the same as you could do with web page test. It's free, it costs you nothing. And the really cool thing is, they have an API, so you could also automate testing in the future. So I think that's quite helpful. Leads me to another point. The thing with performance measurement, I think, which is totally wrong, or that people kind of don't do it the right way, is the fact that it's not a project. It should be something that's ongoing, right? Because with every deployment, things are changing. And then also your competition might change. And also on Cyber Monday or Black Friday, whatever it's called, you might have just more traffic. So the site and the system might react totally differently. So what I would advise to do is kind of get a performance measurement over time. So this is it's an open source dashboard where you can just plug in, it runs web page test in the background. You could probably also, I didn't try, but you could probably also plug in Lighthouse, and it collects all the data and it gives you a nice protocol measurement over time. You can even compare it with competitors, obviously, or any other sites that you kind of care of to monitor. And it's self-hosted. So bit more measurement, because I mentioned that Google did some really cool new stuff, and I thought I'd quite quickly walk you through that as well. So, nice. Sorry, that was the clicker. I have to maybe go back if it doesn't let me. Maybe not. So at least now you know the next screens. That's good. So I think the issue with all the metrics that we have in web page tests, and even worse in page speed insights and all the other ones, is that none of those do really tell us how fast the site feels when you load it. Because what you want is you want to kind of see a certain thing on a site straight away, and you want, Bartosz touched on that as well, you want to interact with something pretty much straight away. You don't want to wait for an experience, right? And this is taken from the thing that they built now into Chrome that's called the Performance Observer. And the idea is to match user experience stages to measurements. So that's basically left and right. So if you would think about what's the most important thing is basically, and I'll walk you through the steps in a second, but what you want is to kind of, if you think YouTube, right? What I want if I go to a YouTube site is I want to see the video and I want to click on the play button and that's it. I don't care about a header, I don't care about navigation, I don't care about related stuff. I want that video and I want to kind of interact with the video straight away. That's the only use case I have if I go to a YouTube video. And this logic kind of can be translated to literally any other site. So the way it works is we have 4 different events, right? So the first thing that we have is time to first paint, which basically just says like, okay, the browser starts to render anything. It could be like this blue bar on top. It doesn't have a meaning, but it's the first thing that comes to the screen. The second event is the first contentful paint. That can be, in this case, it's our navigation bar or the burger menu, but it could also be a text or a logo or anything. It's just like the first kind of useful element. And then the third stage is what we call the first meaningful paint. So in our case, on the start page, it would probably be the banner saying who we are, what we do, or whatever it is. And then the fourth is the so-called time to interactive. That's what we also have in web page test, when you basically can start interacting with the site. So that's the 4 different stages. So how to get to that? That's actually fairly easy. It's still beta, but it works. It only works in Chrome right now. So it's called, and then the top, I'm sure you have seen, this is just the regular tracking in analytics. And then the next one, this script thing from here to there, is basically right now a custom code that you need. So what you do is you register a thing called the performance observer, and then basically you track all these events, the 4 stages that I just mentioned earlier. And this goes back. And it's a bit tricky because right now you have to do it in the code before any CSS comes along the way, otherwise it doesn't work. They're going to be changing that in the future, but first implementation. And then it comes into your analytics. So basically what you have is on the custom events, you have something called the performance metrics tab. I think you have seen that if you've done any other custom event tracking, that's pretty much the same story. And then it gives you, and this is actually quite interesting. So if I look at our page, what happens is like this is the German-speaking homepage, and I see that most important page for us, but the time to interaction is not really great because obviously it's twice as high. So long story short, you could do that in a tag manager as well. The code is in there. You can just copy and paste it, and then you can use it in Google Data Studio and make it really nice. So whatever kind of thing you prefer, it costs you nothing. But it's a way better way to kind of track and measure things than just relying on any page speed score or anything like that. And then, how much do I have? 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes? I'm over already? Jesus. 2 minutes of the Q&A? OK, 2 minutes. Perfect. The last thing, and that's really important, and that kind of adds on top of this one, is the critical rendering path. What we really care about, what we should care about, is not the entire page, but like basically the initial screen, right? So what's visible in the first screen, and I obviously have to flip through it now. But the resolution obviously depends on the device. So that could be a desktop, that could be a mobile phone, that could be a pad. And to kind of figure out how that works, what you need to understand is something called the CSS object model. Basically, it's all the different HTML tags. They have different styles attached to it, right? Font size, font color, anything. And then if you look at the fact how a browser builds that, they take the HTML, they take this object map, they put it together, and then they start to render the site. That's basically how the workflow, very simplified, is going to happen. If you look at how Google does that, it's even more interesting because they don't load any, and that's taken from the dev console again, they don't take any external style sheet. So what they do is they inline all the CSS. Why do they do that? Because obviously the request, we touched on that earlier, to load the external CSS is even slower than inlining that. I don't like doing that because it bloats up the source code. So I think somewhere, for me, the answer is somewhere in the middle. The way to get there is something called, or it's a technology called Critical. You could try that out. It's really cool. Again, it's free. And what it does is basically it takes, you could specify, based on analytics, you take your top 5 resolutions, and it takes your CSS, extracts the stuff that you need for the critical rendering path, and then offloads all the rest to the lower level of the site. And then basically you end up with, this is just to play as a web, I'm just going to walk you through it. So what you end up with is you have this, you have the inline style for the critical rendering path. You load another CSS that's asynchronously, so not blocking the browser. And then there's a fallback for the old versions, and it works literally in all the other browsers as well. So basically, what you end up with is you don't do the full kind of Google approach to inline everything, but you just inline what you really need for the most common resolutions on the different screens and devices you're having. And then the rest is basically off the screen. You don't care about that anyways. And then the answer to that is yes. There's 3 slides which I'm going to flip through. I just compared WordPress with a standard WordPress on the left, a WordPress with the regular performance plugins, and then on the right-hand side, you see basically the process of taking the CSS for the initial render out of it, and again, it brings you 30 to 40%. So that's just really amazing, and it can make a massive difference on big sites. Summary, and then there is, if you want to follow up on that, like a checklist of all the stuff I talked about, plus like 10 million more things. And the link is broken. I figured that someone made it wrong, but it's SME. I don't know why the E is missing. I just realized when I was testing the slides. So, or you just email me, or I guess you're going to be sending the slides as well. So sorry for that, and thanks for having me.
Yes.